Okay, I want to go through chapter 3 right now, and so you have a good idea on how the book's going to work. Now we're going to work through it. The first thing is to keep in mind your basic reason for learning English. And I'm assuming, in putting this chapter together, that you're here for academic and professional reasons. In other words, you want to be able to function in an academic and a professional setting very effectively with the language you use. You don't want people pointing out this, that, and the other thing. You want to be able to perform well in an academic and a professional setting with no worries about the quality of your language. Okay, so that's the core assumption as we go through this. Okay, so let's go through it bit by bit. Now, one of the questions from the beginning is, what is a grammar book? Because we're going to focus on those chapters. And in one sense, it's really this. This is called the Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language. It is nearly 2,000 pages long on very small sheets or very large pieces of paper. You probably don't want to read this. This is a comprehensive view. We don't have time to cover all the aspects of every nuance in the English language. And I assume that you don't want to do that because you're here to learn composition to operate in an academic setting, not to learn every little aspect of linguistics that you've never heard of. So what we're going to do is go through standard written English, not the spoken dialects that you probably use or that you've heard, and that we're not going to go into all that. Okay, we're going to go into what's known as standard written English. This is the language used in professional and academic settings. That's what we're going to do. So the purpose is, back to that purpose again, that purpose to communicate in an academic and professional environment and to do it effectively. Okay. So the first thing I want to cover is a little bit of history. And because it's kind of weird, the language really evolved in what I'm going to break down into are 4 stages. And it depends on whom you talk to, but these 4 are pretty good. So the first thing to understand is that your language came from German. It's in the German family. And it's in the early stages of it, it looked more like this. This is Chaucer's English right here. And it would make absolutely no sense to us today. So, and this word right here, C-Y-N-I-N, that was king. I couldn't tell you what any of these other words meant. If you can read it, boy, then you probably hung out with Beowulf. That is a very different type of English used at a very different time. What would happen is this, the Norman French and Middle English period. This is the period starting in 1066. Now, why 1066 is such an exact date? Because that's when the Norman conquest happened. A guy named, his name was actually William the Bastard when he arrived on the shores of England. By the time that year was done, he was calling himself William the Conqueror. He brought with him, and his name was not Norman, he was from Normandy, France, in northern France. He brought Norman French to England, and what you had was a combination of French and English. And that became the English of today. And you can see it in Chaucer's English, which he's writing around 1380, 1400. And you can see it in this. This is a page which was spelled according to Chaucer's English. When that April with his shore's foot stood, the drought of March hath parched to the root, and bathed every vine and switch liquor. He's talking about the rains of March bathing every vine and going to the roots and all the you can kind of understand that. Even if it is a little bit kind of funky, it's still recognizable as English. It is a little bit different. Our English today is evolved out of this English, but you can tell there is a dramatic difference between Chaucer's English and the English of Beowulf. There's not even a comparison between them because it's radically different in the Beowulf time than it is in Chaucer's time. You can understand this. You can't understand this. So by the end of the Norman conquest, you have really the foundation of what you would recognize today as English. In the Renaissance period, English had expanded a great deal. England had gone out and reached down to South Africa, out to China, and obviously to the Americas. English expanded a great deal, and suddenly people like, like the physicists are writing, other things are happening. This is Isaac Newton's book. Um, English is stepping out, and it's becoming a world language. It is becoming a sophisticated language. In order to expand the language and take account of all these new ideas, of all these new regions, the people who read and wrote English used Greek and Latin in order to expand the language. Notice here that even, this is Isaac Newton's Principia Mathematica. He wrote it in Latin. Everybody who was educated and read and wrote in English also could read and write in either Greek or Latin or both. Isaac Newton knew both. Shakespeare had had 8 years of Latin. He was perfectly fluent in Latin. They introduced new words from Greek and Latin into the English language, and the language expanded enormously. Okay, enormously. It was built on that change that took place during the Norman conquest, that expansion of English during the Renaissance period. And I'm running the Renaissance period up until 1900 because that expansion kept going on. So really the Renaissance ended with King Charles getting his head lopped off, but that behavior of English expanding with Greek and Latin kept going on. It still goes on a little bit today, but not like it did up until 1900. Modern English, the big shift is that literacy rates. Almost everybody could read and write in Latin, and almost everybody contributes to English now, not just the people who know Latin and Greek. That's a very small fraction of the population today. Back in the Renaissance, it was most of the people who read and wrote English knew Latin and Greek. Today, there's all these sources of new words. What we have today is a hybrid language. And those 4 periods contributed to making English what it is today. And you may have noticed that you got words like phone starting with a PH, and words like enough, that same F sound that's at the start of phone is ending with GH. Why is that happening? Well, it's based in the history of the language. It's such a mess. It really is. We have today what is commonly called a hybrid language. These are not very common in the world today. English is. It is a massive language because it is a hybrid and because it is used throughout the world. And that's very unique in languages today. It is larger than Spanish, French, and German combined. It is a massive language. It has an extraordinary vocabulary. But it has an enormous amount of complexity. But don't lose hope. At the core, the structure of the language, it's sensible. It makes perfect sense. It does. And this grammar will focus on that aspect. We won't go into the nightmare of English spelling because it is. Hopefully you guys all have spell check on your computers. That was introduced because of this mess. Okay, thank William the Conqueror for the invention of spell check. Okay. Now, dialects are something that we have today. We have multiple dialects. English is comprised of numerous dialects, okay? And this is a section in your book. Right here. Dialects in standard written English. What you are going to learn is standard written English. What you have to understand, however, is that English is comprised currently of multiple dialects, okay? And that's very important to understand from the beginning. There is no right and wrong in English. I'm not telling you something that is controversial within the field of people who actually study the language. They know this. It's built around dialects, and dialects are rule-based. They are rules that people in different regions or people of different ethnicities, even sexual orientations and eras, not decades, but really eras, You probably have seen a Declaration of Independence and know that it kind of reads a little bit funny. You can understand it. Chaucer had a different dialect than you do. So did Thomas Jefferson. Um, and we have currently in English different dialects. These are, again, rule-based. Each dialect is rule-based. It's not a matter of slang. Slang changes rapidly, and people define themselves according to generation or region, according to slang today, but you know what? In a few years, it's going to change. That's what slang does. Dialects change rather slowly, and they're handed on, and they're used as sources of identity and for communication. Standard written English, and this is the dialect you're going to learn even better now, is a dialect. It's not correct English and the others are wrong. You have to understand it is a dialect among many, and it works incredibly well in professional and in academic environments. That's where it works wonderfully. It works wonderfully within its environment because it's so detailed and it crosses boundaries. It can be used if you're working in, Dublin, Ireland, or if you're working in, Port of Spain, Trinidad, or if you're working in Sydney, Australia. It works perfectly well across the boundaries, and it's detailed and precise. What you're going to want to learn is what's called code switching, not correcting. You don't want to point out that one dialect is correct and the others are wrong. It doesn't work that way. What you have to be able to do is switch from one dialect to the other. And let me show you this very quickly. These are some Trini speakers from Trinidad. This is an island nation not far from Venezuela. And you'll hear this, and it's a dialect that's used in Trinidad.
Yeah, umbrella. Yeah, umbrella.
First stop?
Yes.
McDonald's.
First stop? Pancakes? Morning, morning. Did I have a bag on roti?
No, they don't.
No, they don't.
Yeah, morning.
Yeah, morning, morning. Yeah, I could have a big breakfast with hotcakes.
And if you don't catch that, she's speaking in something closer to standard English. She is speaking in something closer to the Trini dialect. She's speaking in the Trini dialect. When she says morning, morning, that's an aspect of the dialect that she uses that works within the Trini dialect. And it works there. If you don't speak it, you mark yourself as not belonging to the group. And that's very important to understand. She speaks it. In Trinidad, people would recognize her. Oh, she's a Trini. She belongs here. The same thing takes place if you're using, say, the Boston dialect, okay, or the Australian dialect. It's all a matter of marking yourself as belonging to the dialect or not belonging to the dialect. As you go through this, I'm going to be emphasizing standard written English. If you use standard written English, and again, it's not the correct form, it's the educated form. It is an educated dialect used by people throughout the world. You are marking yourself as being familiar with the dialect of educated people who know standard written English. That's why you want to be able to switch into it. And what you do is not correct your other dialects or other dialects you might be familiar with or other dialects that other people use. You don't do that. You're going to strike people as being a snob. What you need to be able to do is switch into dialects as you need to. So what this book does is present standard written English, but always understand this is a dialect. It is not correct, and others are wrong. It is just as correct according to its own rules, and it works according to its methods. Okay, so be able to switch as you need to. When you're working in an academic environment, standard written English is the dialect. When you're speaking with your friends, it's up to you guys. You call the shots, okay? Let's go back to this. And this is the part of the book that can be a little bit challenging, okay? Let me show you this. Let's go back to our friends here. This is a system of systems, okay? What English is a grammar system of systems. In other words, it's got a number of systems built within it. Like a car is both a car, but it also has an electrical system and an auditory system and a steering system. It's a system of systems. And so English, you have to understand, has multiple systems built within it. Think of it that way, and you'll be less likely to get confused as we go through this. It's not that crazy. It is a little bit crazy at times when we switch from systems. So the first system to be aware of is the one that is on parts of speech. Now, again, almost all of you went through elementary school, junior high, and high school learning about 8 parts of speech. I'm going to teach you 6 parts of speech, okay? It's to simplify it a little bit, okay? So that's the parts of speech. That's one level of the language, okay? And that's one aspect. And it's going to be, as we go through that, and that's going to be chapter 8. Chapter 8 is going to go through that, and you're going to be familiar with it. It's going to be a little bit simpler than what you learned before. I organize it a little bit differently. Please understand, these are arbitrary. If she wants to organize it this way, she can do it. If he wants to organize it, he covers, I think, or she covers 24 parts of speech. I believe this one covers like 16. Most of you learned 8. I'm simplifying it to 6, just to make it a little bit easier to learn, okay? The first level is going to be on nouns and verbs, because those are the primary level of language. Those, you can't get around them. And then adjectives and adverbs. Those add more detail to your writing. And then I'm going to show you prepositions and conjunctions, which you probably learned a little. Yeah, we'll go over that again, okay? So understand, when we're doing that, we're learning one level. We're learning the parts of speech level, and I'm just going to cover it. It's going to be what you learned before, but I'm going to shake it up a little bit and do it a little bit differently, okay? But it's not going to be that different. You're just going to learn a simpler way of doing it, okay? The next level, and this is very important, words, phrases, and clauses. These are the units of the language, okay? These are the parts that end up covering the nouns, verbs, the adjectives and adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions. This is a little bit unique, okay? You have to understand from the beginning, nouns are not just single words. They are often whole phrases. If you talk about the red house, it's not just talking about the red and then talking about the house. That phrase is a part of speech. And if I say to my friends, where are you going? To my friends. That phrase, that prepositional phrase, is an adverb. It's explaining where, okay? That's what it is. And so you have to understand that language exists as words, phrases, and clauses. Those are the units of language, and those are the units your brain works with. So letters are just, they come together. Words are just letters that come together and form a meaningful unit in your head. Your mind makes sense out of what's on the page. Language does not make sense without your mind. Your mind doesn't make sense without the words on the page, okay? Language exists somewhere in between. Phrases are the other type of word, they're words that work as a single unit. They're the other type of unit. So it's always important to understand a whole phrase works together in your mind as a unit. Most people think of words as being the units of language. That's what you were taught all along. Really, what your mind does is understands single words, but also single phrases, and also clauses. Those are the other unit, the subject and verb unit, that's a little bit more involved. It has a subject and verb, and they work together as a single unit. Now, most of you have been taught that subjects are distinct from verbs. I'm going to teach you that they really are, in your mind, a single unit. And you're going to see that they can function as adjectives or adverbs or nouns and other things. Whole clauses can. That's right. Whole clauses can function as different parts of speech. That's what they do. So that will be a little bit tricky to get used to at first. It's not all that complicated, but it is a little bit tricky to get your head around at first. Let me come back to this. It is a little bit odd to see this. If you look at this sentence, Sally was meeting with George to discuss the plans for his birthday party. That's 13 words. That's okay. That's how you would generally look at that sentence. How I'm going to teach you to look at this sentence is this way. Okay. Sally was meeting, that's the clause. With George, that's a prepositional phrase. To discuss the plans, that's actually an infinitive phrase. For his birthday party, that's a prepositional phrase. Notice those are different units. This is a clause, this is a phrase, this is a clause, excuse me, this is a phrase, and this is a phrase. So this is a clause, phrase, phrase, phrase. I'm going to teach you that approach to language because that's how I see our brains, our thinking operates more on those levels, at the phrase and clause level. If you can understand that language exists there, it's not just finding the right word, it's generating phrases and clauses, and that will make your writing easier. Okay, so we'll do that as we go through, especially in chapters 8 and in chapters 12. And you'll really get good at it in chapter 16, is how to use phrases and clauses to flesh out your sentences. Okay? And people get this all the time. And once they get the system down, it makes perfect sense because it's what you're doing already. It's in your mind. You don't think word by word. You actually think in chunks of language, not just word by word. Okay? And so then the last aspect, oops, we lost that. The last aspect that we will be doing, the last angle that we'll go through is going through form, function, and style. What the form of a language is, that's chapter 8. Those are the parts of speech. Those are those 6 things that I'm going to give you. We're going to go over that. The function is going to go into more of what clauses are built around. Those are what they do. Okay? Parts of speech are things like nouns and verbs, and adjectives and adverbs. Function are things like subjects and verbs and objects. Notice they seem to be very similar. They're actually not. They're actually a little bit different. They overlap. These two systems overlap with each other. And you might think of this as sometimes a person could be both a boss and a manager at your job, but when she goes home, she's mom, or she's somebody's daughter and somebody else's best friend. Notice the way the same person occupies different roles. It's very important to understand that when you're looking at language, it's like looking at a person. What angle are you going to look at it from? From the form angle, or from the function angle, or from the style? Okay. Style we'll get to. Does it work effectively? Do I like the way this thing functions? We'll get to that. That's going to be a personal preference. But you build your own style using your understanding of form and function. That's what we're going to do with this book. All of this will make sense. Don't worry if it seems a little bit overwhelming right now. We'll come back to this as we keep going through the later chapters. Okay? Everybody take care. In the next video, we'll go over the exercises. Take care.